Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I will be absolutely honest with you, and that is that my BlackBerry drained and I slept through it all. And I must say it's better to wake up to Jeffrey Simpson than it is to wake up to me, more than anybody else. I am delighted to actually be here on the stage this morning, and I want to present some things. I must say that for those of you who only speak French, I apologize because the individuals who put the presentation together had it all translated 5 days ago. But if anybody knows me, I become fixated on research. And as a result, last night at 11:30, I was still working on the presentation because I want to get something boiled out of it that is of absolute necessity for my audience. I do this all the time, and Terry and I have known each other for so many years that he knows that I show up at the last minute and I'm still doing work on the research. And so I will say that the translated version is coming, and we will have all of that stuff. But this morning, I'm just going to introduce you to 30 slides, which will be cogent, and there's a full translated report and everything, but this is as a result of 11:30 last night. Ipsos Reid is a company that I joined 24 years ago. It's been quite a journey because I can tell you that it takes about 30 years to throw out your university texts. I was cleaning out my garage in the fall, and the reality is that I found a photograph of 34 people on the front of a boat in 1989. And that was the company. Today, it is 16,500 people. It is operating in 85 countries. It is a $2.3 billion research company, as opposed to the $4 million in billings that I joined. And outside of Pina, who is here today, and my colleague in evaluation, I have no idea who else works in the company. But the reality is, and I say this to prelude this, is that when Terry approached me, we donated this research for this because we can. But more importantly, this is the prelude to a much greater piece. Every month I poll the world. It's an amazing thing. 5 years ago we didn't think it was possible, but every month I poll 24 countries in the world. And what you're going to see today actually is going to be has been undertaken in 23 other countries. So we'll actually have a benchmark as to where Canada sits with that group in 23 countries. Nothing has ever been done like this. And so it's very exciting to give you a prelude to this. And so I am going to give you lots of graphs and charts, but what we really wanted to do was to check in with the Canadian public and find out what they're seeing in the system. Now, one of the things, obviously, is when you get tons of research, is to try and make it palatable to an audience. And so what I've done here is to provide gap scores and net scores. And what that is basically is to try and figure out what's actually moving and what's not when you look at this. And I'll explain that a little bit more. But more importantly, we looked at 24 specific elements of the system. So we've looked at ease of access and patient experience, care and compassion, coordination and communications, efficiency, time, and money. And what this does is create a whole series of sections within the research, which you can then look at what's moving where, what provinces, what demographics, and you can actually put together a net score, like a scorecard. And so you can actually, so what I'm presenting today is not necessarily the research per se, but more importantly is the net scores. What does it mean? So we've done a lot of this stuff is to try and, as a gap score, if those people in the room don't know our net scores, there are those people within the system who say that they have seen no change. So you take them out and then you see whether or not people think it's better or worse, and you do the math on that, and it produces a net score of either a negative or a positive. And so you get a sense of whether the Canadian public see any particular changes. So that's what we're going to do this morning. There's a huge amount of data, as I've said, a massive amount. We will make this publicly available on our website, and we have a report that goes with it, and we'll continue to work on this because it's an area which we very deeply have been involved with for many years. The methodology is very straightforward. It was actually conducted between January 4th and the 18th of this year. Hence, that's why I'm up at 11:30 still working through it. It's like doing a PhD thesis on the weekend. But I've got great colleagues who have worked through this. Now, what we've done is we've actually narrowed the group of people who we've actually talked to. I call these citizen patients. They are the largest group of people, 18 to 64. They're not the elderly and they're not the young, but they're the group of people who use the healthcare system the most. Online methodologies, I will say, is completely accurate nowadays. Maybe 10 years ago it would have been very different, but when we do things online, let's put it this way, our colleagues did the U.S. election and were the #1 voted out of the United States for accuracy. It was all done online. So for those of you who might say that online methodologies don't work, they're absolutely standardized. And the second thing is that we then can make it look exactly like the country. So what you're going to see today is what has done. And all of this is the natural stuff that journalists like Jeffrey Simpson would know, that we have to put in the plus or minus 3.5 or nothing is proper. So we've got the methodologies, but what I want to do now is talk about the actual research. One of the things that we did was, in order to do the cross-tabulations on this research, was to ask people whether or not they had a doctor, and if they didn't, how they in fact would work through the system. So I just put this up as a demographic. So what you see here is that there's 62% of the sample who said that they actually had a doctor, but then there's a whole series of delineations after that. So you've got 16% who have a healthcare team, and then you've got the rest of the people here, as you can see, walk in off of the street or use an emergency ward or other people. So this is a really good view of how people can access the system. And the reason that this question was asked was not just for demographics, but more importantly, we're trying to understand that when you are with a physician and you are referred to somebody within the system, how does that work? So we're looking at the efficiency of when somebody goes and presents and they have to go somewhere in the system, how do they feel about that? What is their patient experience? And a whole series of. So this is in fact a really a good diagram that shows that 23% of the people in this country do not have a family physician between the ages of 18 and 64. The study, very quickly, as I said, 24 specific elements. And as a result, as Terry knows, I've been given half an hour. My wife would say that I cannot even say hello in half an hour. So I'm going to zip through this at the best I can. So we asked people to think back to 2008 and ask them about the ease of aspects to the healthcare system and whether they would gain access compared to 5 years ago. And what you can see here, which is fascinating, is that 29% actually say that it's easier for them to access the healthcare system. 25% would say that it's worse. So the net score, of course, is a +4. But take a look here at no change from 5 years ago, 46% of the population. So, you know, you start to get an understanding right off the bat that there's a few people who have seen or experienced some kind of change in the system. And again, yes, this is all of their perceptions. But then what we started to do was to go through various aspects of the healthcare system, of which you find here that roughly 30% will say, it's 29, 30%, in the rounding, say that it's easier to get drugs for various ailments. And when you take the 10% who say it's worse, you end up with a net score. So you then look at the test for diagnosis, and you find that there's a 28% who say it's easier, and the net score is +12 because you take the 28 and you minus the 17, and that's what you end up with. And I'll show you why that's important in just a minute. So you've got the test for diagnosis. We then looked at seeing a doctor. But what's important is to take a look again at the middle ground and say that 53% see no change whatsoever. So we've got a net score there where in fact we're ahead. We also looked at hospitals. And again, you'll see here where we get into regions. But hospital access, not so much. And a specialist physician such as a surgeon, clearly it's a difficulty. So we've examined this to say that we've made progress in terms of perceptions with the low-hanging fruit, but absolutely getting to a specialist still is a bottleneck. Okay, so this is what I work on. This is a scoring card system. What this allows you to do is to look across the provinces and the regions of this country and see where people, in fact, are perceiving that there's progress or not. And we'll add up all of this at the end of the day and look at regions and say, you know, where is the perception that they're doing well. But you can see here that all the red spots, Atlantic Canada, in fact, in terms of access, has problems. Ironically, at the end of the day, Atlantic Canada is seen as, by their own people, as being one of the best healthcare systems in the country. So even though they're having a hard time getting through to people, but you can see here across the board that when you add all of this up, that the province which actually comes out ahead on access is Ontario. And again, we're dealing with patient experiences and we're dealing with perceptions. But the McGuinty government, of course, over the last number of years had said that we are going to concentrate on trying to get people more access to the healthcare system, and it works. People believe that to be the case. And if you measure other things in healthcare, you will find that the public actually feels that there's been a lot done in that area. So whether it's through publicity or through government policy or through actual experience, Ontario's out in front. And the province which is lacking all of this is, as you can see on the right-hand side, is Atlantic Canada. So when you take a look at all of these different things, and I know you're all from different regions of the country, what you find is that the only place which actually has some movement in this is to do with drugs, and it's in British Columbia. Now, I won't make a comment on the public in access to that, but you can see here that when you go through the least improved areas, overall net, Ontario ranks at the top, and that least improved is British, is on the right-hand side. Then we took a look at rating the patient experience, and we looked at a whole series of different aspects of this. Better information shared with me. So when I get referred to somebody, my goal in this research was to try and understand that when you get into the system, do people keep track of you? You know, I have a chronic medical condition that's down through the family, and I do find my own experience to relate to stuff like this, where you go and you have a test done and then you go back to your original doctor and he says, well, I don't have the chart here, you'll have to go back to the other guy and take a look at what he found. And it's much the same with everybody. So first of all, you find that there's a sense in this country overall that there is better information shared. There are more options given, and those of you in the healthcare system know that in the last decade, there are people like myself who show up with my doctor with all of the stuff off the internet and challenge him on his diagnosis and a whole series of things. So more options are given to me for treatment because I challenge and I ask about this, and I go online and I look at the different hospitals and things like that. So I'm a better informed citizen, maybe not always the best patient, but I do this. Better coordinated. You find that there's a sense that it is better coordinated when someone is referred into the system. More sensitive to my needs. In fact, you end up with more people in this country saying that that's the case. A better level of care. Yes, I mean, look at the scorecards here. Speedier, it's a flat. But everybody else in the country basically believes that their area of care within the system and their patient experience is better than it was 5 years ago. Except, take a look at the middle. 6 and 10 basically say no change, okay? So when you look at this, in terms of patient experience, there's only a few places here where, in fact, you find where people are less enthusiastic about their care in the system. And you can see that here. It's about speed, and it's basically in Atlantic Canada, in British Columbia, and Alberta. So the sense across the country is that the access is a little bit better, but their patient experience once they get into the system is actually better than it was 5 years ago. And when you overall look at this, you find that the most improved is the province of Quebec in terms of the patient experience. Now, I will say that Quebec is a very interesting province because when you look at access, you will find that most of the people say that they can't get access. But once they get in the system, they think it's the best. So that's what comes up here. So they're at the top of the list there, and you can take a look and see who the leaders and the losers are. Constantly through this, take a look at the right-hand side of the page. and British Columbia on patient experience and on the individual access points is chronically perceived as the worst jurisdiction in the entire country on every measure whatsoever, absolutely bar none. So when you add it all up, you can actually see that there are winners and losers. When you go through this and you add up the net totals, so you take the patient experience, you take the access issues, and you add them up into a scorecard. Ontario, in fact, rates at the top of the list in terms of perception, and at the bottom of the list is British Columbia on almost every measure whatsoever. So this gives you folks in the room a scorecard in terms of what region and province you're dealing with. But there were 3 other sections. We also then looked at care and compassion. You know, do people feel that they are actually involved in a system that's going to help them? Coordination, communication, and then efficiency of time and money. So the first thing we do is we then looked at a series of statements which people can agree or disagree to. So generally as a patient, I'm treated with respect and sensitivity when I'm interacting with the healthcare providers. 84% of the people in Canada agree with that. So yes, I'm treated with dignity. My experience has made me not trust, so this is a negative question, any process within the system, in the healthcare system or its professionals. I personally stay on top of everything. In other words, they don't trust that they are going to get from one place to another, and you're dealing with 43% of the population. Only 14% trust the entire system. So people are, it's a big number, and you find that 35% actually feel that they're abandoned. So part of this conference today was to look at how people feel when they actually enter the system. Are they, you know, going for an MRI, going for a test or something like that? Do they feel like they're on their own? And the answer is that for about 35 to 40% of the public, they're saying that once I leave that physician's office to go somewhere else within the healthcare system, I'm on my own. So there isn't any follow-up. So if you live in Toronto, you hear ads every once in a while about people who do nothing but in the private sectors coordinate your visits. You pay for an extra thing, but they make sure all the charts and records are put together in one place, and they make sure you get from one place to another. Yeah, it's 43% of the market love those people because they feel totally abandoned when they get into it. I'm scared to be referred to other parts of the healthcare system because ultimately my experience in terms of how others treat me for my ailment will be bad. 30%, 31%. So we have 3 in 10 to 4 in 10 who actually feel vulnerable when they get into a system. And of course, you'll see this, that it's in different parts of the country. My personal doctor who refers me is always up to date with information about my diagnosis and treatment. Okay, so that makes sense. You've got 30% roughly who say that they are vulnerable, but you've got about 3/4 who say that their doctor's on top of it. I'm confident that once I am referred into the healthcare system for further diagnosis and treatment, that the doctor and caregiver that referred me gets continuous updates and copies of what's happening to me as everything is in one place. Again, 68% would say that. And you can see the blue bars in the middle, the light blue bars. You get on one side the dark blue bars, which are people who totally believe that that's the case. And then you get people in the middle who are basically saying, yeah, well, most of the time. Is a very typical Canadian response, which is, yeah, sometimes. And then you get the rest of the people who say no. It's really very easy where all of the doctors and caregivers talk to each other along the way and know what the other person has done or is doing. So again, that comes back to about 35% who don't believe that to be the case. And it seems that no parts of the diagnosis treatment process are coordinated and getting regular improvement information about my condition. So 41%. So out of all of these statements, what you're finding is that roughly 35 to 40% of the public, no matter where they are in this country, believe that once they cast off from their diagnostic physician and go into the healthcare system, that they are not getting that treatment. So if the diagnosis came back to my doctor that is bad and I required urgent treatment, I know that he would call me, or he or she would call, they would call me. Most people agree with that. The healthcare system I experience is efficient in the best way possible without wasting time or effort. Only half the public believing that. And the healthcare system I experience is efficient in a way that maximizes the use of dollars allocated or paid for healthcare in ways that don't waste the money or resources of the system. Only half. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us across the country, this is one of the key pieces here, is that when we go through all of those areas, we find that Atlantic Canada, in fact, with these areas of comfort, actually are the most supportive of it, and that Quebec, in fact, is the least. We find that on care and compassion, that most people in that part of the country believe that they have the most sensitive healthcare system. We find that when it comes to coordination and communication, that the prairies, in fact, Saskatchewan and Manitoba believe they are in the worst situation, but Atlantic Canada believe that they're in the best circumstances. We find that efficiency of time and money is worst in British Columbia, but kind of scattered in other parts of the country. Now, that's a lot of graphs and charts. A couple more for you, though, that when you add up the net scores for the report card, so I've taken all of those 24 elements and I've done the math on them, and then we end up here, we can actually see, based on the questions and on the time, is there a winner or a loser in all of this? Well, one would say it's up to the patients to decide. But regardless of how inefficient or lack of caring and stuff like that, Atlantic Canada, in fact, is the winner, with Ontario following close behind. And the loser in all of this is in British Columbia. So based on a scorecard of progress, we have different groups who are saying that we're further ahead or we're behind over the last 5 years, and in treatment in the last 2 years in terms of their own attitudes and patient experience. Okay, so let me sum this up again. Tons of data. I've just gone through a bunch of graphs and charts. There's lots more, as you can tell, but I wanted to kind of summarize so that you could go away with your own scorecards. Now let me summarize. Points to ponder. Before anyone pops the champagne, let's take a look at this and see that there's actually the net average of people who say there's been no change in the system is about 55%. So these are people who have gone into the system and not seen any change. So we're really dealing with the gap scores, and the same with their own experience within the system. 6 in 10 don't see any change whatsoever to anything. So last night at 11:30, I am trying to figure out, well, what does this all tell us? Okay, so we've got all these gap scores, and we, ponder this because we do an enormous amount of research on patients and doctors, and I mean, a lot of you in this room, we've done research for you, or I've done it personally for you. So I get to stand up here and own the podium for a minute. What am I going to tell you? Well, first of all, things are getting better, not worse, and certain provinces and regions trump others. Okay, so that's evident. Take your scorecards home, study them. You'll get access to all the data, whatever you want, challenge them, but you'll be able to see all of this. But it raises a fundamental question to me. We've pumped billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars into a healthcare system, and we actually have a public right now, 56%, almost 6 in 10, who actually don't see any change whatsoever. So whether it was the Martin government who did all the negotiations and spent all the money, or it's Jim Flaherty who went to lunch one day and said 3%, see you later. Or they have institutional care that, in fact, they are going to put in place over the next period of time. And we're not talking about the graying and aging population here. We're talking about institutions like hospitals and doctors. And the one thing that struck me was actually the Aboriginal issue in this country. So I'm going to be controversial for a moment, because what was interesting about the poll that we just finished doing on that topic was that when Chief Spence went out recently with a talking stick, it became a lightning rod. And what we found was that every time that she went out and talked about accountability in the system, in fact, every time she went out and protested about the situation of Aboriginals on their own reserves, she became the icon for lack of accountability. And so 84% of Canadians actually turned around and said, where's the money? 81% of the money we've given you, $105 million for 3,500 people, which is basically, if you go to Eganville, Ontario, it's double the size of a small town. Where's the money? So all of this idle no more stuff is actually reflecting back on an issue of accountability as opposed to the progress. And we found that in 1989, when I first started studying it, that 35% said that it was our fault that the issues in Aboriginal Canada were the way they were. And we find now that 60% say it's your fault. So there comes a tipping point at some point within the different issues that we look at. And I was struck by the fact that after pumping all these billions of dollars into the system, that we in fact have a great majority of the population seeing no change whatsoever, even in their own personal experience. The issue that we have then is that if the institutions and key stakeholders in a public system continually form parades that chant that the system is chronically underfunded, when does the accountability hammer fall, and when do citizen patients opt for other ways? This is a critical point for healthcare in this country. Because if you're always whining about something and you're pumping billions of dollars into it, then at some point somebody's going to say, where's the beef? So you're actually up against a couple of things. For some people in the system, that's a desirable motive because they are looking for a privatized system. So they want more health care that's going to be delivered out of the back pocket of people. But for other people, and there are many in this room, who believe in a publicly funded system, that they want that with some edging around it with private stuff, you're getting to the point where all of this money pumped into it is seeing no progress by the vast majority of people in this country. And then the question comes, well, what are you spending it on? So school boards in Toronto are now hammered because they spent $129 on a light socket to put in the wall. And people say that you can't do that. The ombudsman in different places doesn't have access to health care, but if they did, they certainly would be treading out some things. So I raised this issue for one main reason, and I've been looking at all of this for many, many years. If we want to champion a healthcare system where dollars are going and that they are actually doing some good, then we have to change the tactic in terms of how we are trying to access that money from the public good. In other words, we have to start celebrating some of these successes, because otherwise it's very similar to the Aboriginal circumstance. That the tactic has always been show the devastation on reserves and you get more money and you get public sympathy. And the reality is that's over. It's completely over. So at what point in the next period of time is it when we start having in 2015 more seniors than younger people in the system? Is it in 2023, then in certain provinces, you're going to be looking at 60 cents on the dollar for every expenditure whatsoever in tax revenue base on health care? What is the tipping point? And I say this after looking at many different pieces of research over the last number of years. Are we on a tactic which says that if it's worse, you'll get more money, as opposed to let's start celebrating different things within the system as stakeholders so that we can at least give some balance to the public that we're making progress, because otherwise there's going to be some drastic changes. I'm all for, anybody, I said last night, anybody hear of brown fat? I'm all in favor of that. We've done some studies in this country that shows that brown fat actually reduces, it burns carbohydrates more than yellow fat. And they're actually going to start making pills on it. The public, for whatever minor area that is, that's success, because they can relate to it. It's not the best MRI, it's not, you know, something else technically, but the public and the patients can relate to those sort of things. So there's low-hanging fruit that we have to do. Now, the last things I want to leave you with is this. If the institutions and key stakeholders in a public system continually form parades, as I've said, the latter may be desirable. If we're not celebrating those things, then, you know, where are we headed with this? The scorecards are important to a degree, but as I've said, there's about 6 in 10 who don't see any progress whatsoever in the system. And that's important to be able to tell those people that there, in fact, are changes in things that are happening. As I said, there's an enormous amount of research here. What we are going to do is we are going to benchmark that against 23 other countries which we have the data in, so you can look at scorecards and compare Canada to other places around the world. There is a fully translated report. These slides are not fully up to date in the French version, but all of this will be made available to you online for free within the next couple of days. And so, Terry, I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I guess briefly, I'm a little over my limit, but that's because I slept in after my BlackBerry. So.
Thank you so much, John, and I think you're going to have a tremendous legacy of information that those of us in this room who are interested can interrogate a little bit more deeply. I'm afraid we have time for only one question or comment, and I'm going to invite Brenda McGibbon. Is Brenda in the room?
There.
Please, to offer that question and comment.
Well, I'm a patient rep from the McGill University Health Center. I'm fortunate to live in Quebec, where it is mandated by law that every hospital, every rehabilitation center, every long-term care facility has an elected comité des usagers.
Yeah.
And I wish I could say, like Shalom said, that he read the book before Jeffrey Simpson spoke. I wish I could say that I'd seen the slides before you spoke. But I am really sort of upset at the middle ground where between 50 and 60% see that there's been no improvement. And I've been a patient representative during that period, and it was really bad 5 years ago too. And just little examples like telephone access at hospitals, and we receive complaints from patients that don't want to use the ombudsman, which is sort of more of a legalistic process. And I just received one where someone went to the emergency, he got a consult to a clinic, and then he had to phone the clinic for a rendezvous, and he did it for 2 weeks, sort of it's good to have redial on your phone. And he couldn't get any answer, so he had to take a day off work. He went to the clinic, and they lost the consult, but they did give an appointment. I mean, their access is terrible.
Yeah.
And I don't
reflected.
know, I could really cry that people don't see any improvement, and I think that's a true picture.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a disconnect between what ordinary people want in terms of access and what exists. And unless you have patients sort of talking about it and doing something about it, and trying to have some influence, I don't see any other way to go. Would you care to answer that? Yeah,
let me comment and then to put an advertisement in front of you for another part of the healthcare system that I'm deeply involved with. The first is that what you're saying is reflective in the data, okay?
Yes.
So that's fine. But what Jeffrey Simpson said at the end of his presentation was absolutely critical, and that is that we have a disparate patient-citizen group in this country, so there's no acting force. There secondly is a lot of confidentiality with the circumstances, and we don't have ombudsmen and others who can go in and look at the system and hold it accountable. So you're dealing with a public system which in many ways is exempt from that kind of positive criticism in order to move things along. So I wholeheartedly agree not only on the research that we've been presented, there are certain parts of the country though that are learning how to do it better. And as a result, you know, we oftentimes think of the big institutional issues, and a lot of us here are, but it really comes down to very simple questions like, if I go to see somebody in another place, how do I get the records from here to there? and then back again. So what this forum obviously is meant to do is to look at that patient experience, to try and close the gaps, to try and focus on what you're about, not only at the institutional level, but right at the very basic part. So I agree with you. I can't answer it any more than to say the research and you are, there. The real issue is how do you advocate within the system or outside of the system? It's a little bit like mental illness when you look at people in advocating. It's okay when you have people who have autism. They are a single group who are able to go down to Queen's Park or to some other place and advocate for more attention to that. But mental illness in general, I mean, you've got to rely on other people like Bell Canada and people to get the word out. There's no constituency for general stuff. So, I think within the next 2 to 3 years, as I've said, there's a tipping point that's coming because we're going to have to make choices between what the institutions are offering and the graying and aging population, where 80% of our healthcare money is spent at the final end. And that's going to be a very interesting dynamic where we've got a section of the public who's able to influence things. So, it must be very frustrating for you, but there's no clear answer at the moment, except in this room where you can get institutional leaders together and say, how do we make sure that at the end of the day of making decisions, we have the patient experience right at the top of the list? And so the advertisement, I am very involved in mental health for soldiers in this country. I have been dedicated the last 5 years to try and help soldiers with PTSD. And I got to tell you, folks, I'm with a group called Military Minds. We have 100 people. We have 31,000 members, and we have 100 people in a screen chat room. And at the end of the day, I can tell you that since Christmas, I've lost 3 of those people to suicide. And we had to do an intervention on the weekend where a young man of 25 years of age had come back from 2 tours in Afghanistan with 3 kids and a wife, and decided to doff himself, and he ended up being saved because we were able to be on the scene, and he got tasered as a result and taken to an institution. And we have, and this is why I want to bring it back to you and then finish. We have a situation in our organizations where patients are living, breathing human beings. And the one thing that is not being looked at, because you're throwing money at it, is we're not getting a situation where people in this room, for instance, sit down and say, if we're going to take a patient experience from this place to that place, how do we connect the dots? All I want to do is find off-ramps to get soldiers who are in deadly difficulty. And I want to find the off-ramp to get them the help. And so what I find within the system there is we've got everybody talking about the big picture, but no one connecting the dots. And everybody's saying that we want best case outcomes. So I say, well, go cure cancer then. What I'm looking for is a life raft. I don't care about 5 years from now. I want now a nurse with triage experience in mental health to get out there and make sure that people are getting the assistance that they need. And I think at the end of the day, if this conference produces anything, whether it be your experience or be the experience for select cohorts, is that people actually remember that it's a patient-focused system and that there are real people. And whether we all have to remember that show where you get the CEO goes on the front lines and changes jobs and sweeps up. Mm-hmm. We have to do that because at the end of the day, what you're asking for is actually pretty simple. And that is to be heard, to be followed, and to be looked after. And we have lots of systems in this country where we spend a lot of time talking institutionally, but we don't talk about the patient.
I just want to have the last word and say in Quebec, it's working slowly. And all the users committees are get together. And and the English-speaking ones in the Montreal area get together, and so we know more about what's there for rehab. And it's only because the government mandated it that we have and given some sort of money so that we can actually go together that it works.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, and we'll make sure you have access to all of this. Thank you, John. Thank you.